Welcome to Jelly with Daniel. I am your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today I am here with two guests, and we are going to talk about the Jewish and medical intersection, which we could probably go all night, so we'll have to try to limit ourselves. But I am here with Dr. Dan Cooper, who is a professor of pediatrics here at UC Irvine, and his daughter Nora, who is an investigative journalist, a writer, a bartender. And we are here to really talk about a topic that broaches probably 1,000 years, different geographies in the world. I was trying to figure out where to start, and I'll throw a little bit of a curveball because we did not discuss this when we were planning it out, but I saw since the time that we had planned to do this podcast, the story of the two nurses in Australia sort of went viral. For listeners that aren't aware, I'll sort of give the rough spark notes, and we can use this as a little bit of a conversation to weigh into how we even ended up, that you as a professor of medicine ended up being sitting here talking about this. But in Australia, there were two nurses, both from an Islamic background, and they were on some sort of social media device during a shift, and at some point they ended up talking to an Israeli videographer or blogger or something, and they were talking about how much they hate Israel. And this is, again, while they're on a night shift. Just a little bit of background: in Australia, there's universal health care, so nurses are governmental employees paid for by taxpayer money. And this Israeli person who popped up in the video asked, if you hate Israelis so much, what would you do if an Israeli came into the hospital? And these nurses, one of them said, well, I wouldn't treat them. And the other actually bragged about cases where there were Israelis that they explicitly did things to actually harm the Israelis. This ended up being a huge shock in Australia. I believe one, if not both of them, have a criminal trial awaiting. But for me, this started a much wider conversation because you think medicine is pure, right? Like, I totally get why history and political science and English are able to be politicized, because there's a lot of subjectivity to it. But at the end of the day, if I need surgery or my arm is broken or I'm in a car accident, you would think that there's no bias involved in that at all. So give us a little bit of the background. How are you ending up sitting here? Paint the picture for us.
Great. Well, first of all, thanks for having us. And it's a really important topic. And it's a great question. I think just to add to what you described, one of the individuals that you spoke of actually said that he literally would kill Israelis if he was taking care of them. And I think that's where the criminal part really has come into being. I think there's kind of two ways in which we look at this intersection between Judaism and medicine. So one is very positive, and that is the fact that the Jewish people have had this affinity for healthcare and medicine for thousands of years. We laugh about Jewish doctors and all that, but the truth of the matter is that Jews have really been attracted to that profession for many, many different reasons. I think most of them have been really noble and good and altruistic and based on elements within Jewish tradition as well, and about doing good and about choosing life. The other side of the coin, and I learned much of this from Nora and her research, is the way in which medicine had actually been used to foment anti-Semitism. So it's really, and sort of in some ways, a very terrible dichotomy, this relationship between Judaism and anti-Semitism.
So if we can attempt to do this chronologically, I know it's hard because we'll probably be bouncing around. One of the things that's stunning, and right now I'm teaching a class on medieval Jewish philosophy, so we're talking Jews mostly in Spain, France, 900 to 1500. And you go through these different Jewish legal scholars, Talmudists, biblical commentators, philosophers, and it's almost like a joke on the slides by now, because when you're putting in their bio, you also put position, right? So it's not just, okay, everybody knows about Moses Maimonides, but the philosopher and poet Judah Halevi, Nachmanides, the mystical scholar, Ibn Gabirol, he wrote many, songs and poems. He was a Neoplatonist. It's just, over and over again, Gersonides, the early, astrologer, philosopher, right? It's like every single one. It's almost, I would be surprised if I took a time machine to the year 1000 or 1100 in Spain and I met a Jewish scholar who wasn't also a doctor at the same time. And this was fairly unique in the Middle Ages, right? It's not that everybody was doctors, but actually both in Christendom and the wider Islamic world, Jews were basically doctors for everyone. I mean, just the other fun fact, and then I'm going to ask you, why you think this, and just to give you the forewarning, Maimonides' son, right, Abraham Maimonides, he lived most of his life in Cairo. Moses Maimonides had to flee Spain at a young age when the Almohad Muslims came and invaded, right? They issued this ultimatum to Jews in the south of Spain: convert or you'll be killed. So Maimonides ran away. And then Cairo was a pretty welcoming place to Jews, right? That was also, of course, in the Islamic world. He was the personal doctor of Salah ad-Din's family, right? Salah ad-Din was the Islamic conqueror who, the entirety of the Middle East looks the way it does because of Salah ad-Din, right? That's the equivalent to, I don't know, the White House doctor being a Jew in a time when Jews are not equals. I mean, that's a fascinating thing. I mean, why is this the case that in, our Jewish history, we have so many doctors, right? It's not just a joke about America in the last two generations. It's really as far back as you can go.
Well, some of it might be because even then, in the period that you were discussing, there were limited career opportunities for Jews that involved the things that were quintessentially Jewish, which was studying, learning, and advancing knowledge, right? I mean, I think if you look throughout our history biblically, you have from the book of Job, for example, you have that wonderful scene where Job confronts the whirlwind, and the whirlwind, which is basically God saying, hey, Job, you're asking me all these tough questions, but what do you know? Do you know what makes the earth? Do you know science? And so this quest for knowledge plus the economic reality led Jews to take on a profession which many people didn't want to take on, which was healing and well-being. And so then, because the total amount of quote knowledge was less than now, you could be all those things and a doctor at the same time. But Nora pointed out to me there's something that you related to about how there were these seemingly paradoxical combinations of known anti-Semites in history and Jewish doctors. Nora, you pointed some of these cases out to me.
Yeah, I think notably Adolf Hitler is someone people are familiar with as an anti-Semite. He had a Jewish family doctor who he was very fond of. There's like a long history of correspondence between them. He treated his mother, and interesting, his mother actually died. He didn't necessarily save her life, this doctor. And yet Adolf Hitler and his siblings felt very fondly towards this man throughout his life. And he personally assisted his escape from Germany. He would write him letters regularly to check in on him. He's known to have called him an edel Jude, a noble Jew. And he said that if all Jews were like this doctor, then we wouldn't have a Jewish question.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. I mean, my gut reaction is almost to recall. I mean, you look at Pew polls pre-October 7th in Gaza in terms of trust of Jews, and it's very low, but yet you have all these, now heartbreaking stories of people from the southern kibbutzim that actually took, Gazans to Israeli hospitals. So it is this paradox of, Jews are liars and cheats, and they're just here to get our money, and, they're just here to kill all of us. And yet, somebody needs a surgery. Oh, we have to go to Jewish doctors. I mean, is that just another one of these anti-Semitic paradoxes of the Jews are, the arch capitalists and also the arch socialists? Is there something more there?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting sort of misconception about anti-Semitism that it's just bigotry, and it's not. It's a conspiracy theory. It's a philosophy. It's a set of ideas that you have, stories that you have about what Jews are and who Jews are. And one of those things is that we're good doctors. So included within all of the bias, even though people are sometimes scared of Jewish doctors, for the most part, we seem to be trusted as physicians because that's a part of the story that exists among all of the other stuff that we murder children to make matzah, that we're cheats, that we're, whatever else, that we're perverts, whatever it is, all of those things can be true, and Jews are good doctors. Those are all part of this anti-Semitic conspiracy, the story that's told about us. And I think the disservice of talking about it as though it's people just don't like us because we're different is that gets so obscured, and it does seem paradoxical. But if you think about it as something else, like a capitalist, you can hate the rich all you want. You can kill the rich, eat the rich. But if you're sick, you're going to want to go to a fancy hospital and get fancy care. And you're going to trust it more than you would trust a shitty hospital in a lower income place.
I want to add to something that Nora said, and this is a bit of human psychology that has been studied. And I remember reading articles about disasters in, the South when there was still literal apartheid in the United States. And after disasters, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, there would be, and psychologists studied this, there would be these moments when Black communities and white communities, in those moments after the disaster, all of this racial animus would disappear for this brief period of time when there was an element of human need that was able to overcome these cultural biases, as Nora was talking about. So I think healthcare falls into that. When you're sick or when a relative is sick, it's the disaster happening to you. And you may have had these preconceived notions which would prevent you from sitting on a bus in the case of the South with a person of a different race. But at that moment when you needed that person, when you needed that Jewish doctor because he was known to be honest and good, that animus went away for that moment. And I think that's the description here that we're seeing and that you described in some of the more medieval examples as well.
Sure. I mean, okay, so just to a little bit, overview, and then we can go to modernity here. There's this paradox because, as you said, and I'll add a little bit to it. I mean, Judaism is such an action-centric tradition, right? I mean, you have the famous debate in the New Testament, faith over works, right? And most of the Christian tradition sides on faith over works. In other words, what's important is what you believe, where you put your faith, the less action. Now, of course, the New Testament's not talking about action such as, such as healing. They're talking about ritual. So, okay, you don't need to put on tefillin or you don't need to eat kosher diet because you have faith. But I think Jews kind of took this to the extreme as like, no, the only thing we really could do is like, the tangible things of, doing work. And so even connected to this idea that got sort of like endlessly, shallowized, this idea of tikkun olam, which is a serious Jewish idea. Oftentimes people, just use it as a stand-in for, vague social justice. But tikkun olam really is the philosophy that Judaism believes people are empowered to fix the world. In other words, it's not God who's going to save the world, right? And that's a pretty radical Jewish formulation, but it's sort of been one of the dominant strains of Jewish thought of stop waiting around for God or for someone else. Like we are actually the people who have to do it. So, okay, Jews have been overrepresented in medicine for probably 1,000 years, if not longer. We don't exactly have records of, the 6th century in terms of who were doctors. Let's start with America first, because the story begins obviously before Zionism here. In the 1800s, there were, Jews were still disproportionately represented in medicine in America. I'm actually teaching a class now on American Jewish history. And because I knew we were doing this, I looked it up. And, you had these two major waves of Jewish immigration to America. One was in the 1820s and 30s, mostly German Jews fleeing the Napoleonic Wars. And then the big one, which probably everyone knows about, is, the 1880s through World War I. That's, the Eastern European Jews. That's, my ancestry. I would, I don't want to presume, I'm going to guess, some of your family was involved there. Right. And so Jews immediately took to the medical field. And so if you visited a hospital in 1910, chances are, right, there was a higher percentage than the population shows that, Jews would be their doctors. But then in the interwar period, something began to switch, and there actually started being these strict quotas that started barring Jews from med schools, which is a really interesting story. So I wonder if you can sort of pick that up, because one of the reasons, just to explain for listeners, how we ended up having this conversation is exactly 2 weeks ago. I know because it was the day that my daughter was born. You gave a presentation to the entire UC Irvine surgical team, and there was about almost 200 people there between online and in person, and it was all about Jews, medicine, anti-Semitism, any and all of that, which we can get into sort of contemporary issues in a little bit, but unpack us through a little bit of that history of medical schools, Jewish admissions, all of that.
Well, I think you laid the framework perfectly. There was, as the number of Jews increased in the United States, there was, and Nora has really extensively researched, there was almost a worldwide contagion around this sort of concept of eugenics, which was very, very much tied to anti-Semitism. And there was, for a bunch of reasons, some of which were economic, there was the perception among many medical schools in the United States that there were, quote, too many Jews that were being admitted. And some of it may have been economic fears from the majority population at that time. And so starting, as you pointed out, in the 1920s and probably before, and through the 1950s and 1960s, there were definitive quotas on Jews, and it was done at different medical schools in different ways. It was some of the med schools actually looked at people's names. Some of them unabashedly put quotas down. Only 4 or 5 Jews could be admitted to medical school. My wife, Nora's mom, was born and raised in communist Poland, and there was a fair amount of anti-Semitism there. And the Jews in medical schools and law schools there were admitted, but they could not sit during class in Poland. They had to stand. But they said, damn it, we're going to go and we're going to stand and we're going to be really, really good. But the drive for Jews, even in that period of time, to become physicians, again, it was driven, there was some socioeconomic. The Jews were learners. This was the culture to study. Study was a keynote of becoming a physician. You had to know how to study. You had to know how to even do critical thinking. It was a way into more mainstream American society because it was a profession that was well remunerated and it had been at the time and continues to be so. And it brought respect and honor to the people because physicians were respected and in Jewish tradition. And I like that you brought up the concept tikkun olam. That's probably part of that, part of our ethos. So there were, when it became recognized that these quotas were going on, there were many Jewish organizations which fought them hard and demanded that, you've got to have a true level playing field for admission to medical school and universities based on grades, based on tests, based on criteria that were objective rather than subjective. And there were efforts for example, in the state of New York, there was a whole commission that was established that looked at the problem in the 1950s and 60s, identified that there was true racism for Blacks, for Jews in getting into med school. Laws were passed. And I think by the 1960s and 70s, most of these quotas had gone away.
It's interesting because, a similar story can also be told about the Ivy Leagues and the undergrad, right?
Yeah.
Most of the Ivy Leagues in some way in the 40s through 60s had some policy that was based off of getting fewer Jews, right? So Columbia had, personality tests that, where they would say, we want people that are interested in things that, just the selection biases that Jews tend to not be interested in, or from certain neighborhoods, all of those things. And so, it is a very interesting parallel there. It also, some part of me is being torn to talk about contemporary issues. Some wants to stay in the history, but I'll allow myself to give in for a second. The sort of debate between merit-based admission and, non-merit-based admission, whether the non-merit-based admission is privileging white Protestant, WASPs, or whether the merit-based admission is, people of color and everything like that, in both ways, it's almost hurt Jews. And, Jews now kind of find, many Jews were advocating the liberal position against, hey, it shouldn't be, the med school shouldn't be privileging, WASPs, white Protestants just because they're white Protestants. In the same way, now you have a lot of people in the Jewish community that are sort of, old school liberals, right? They should look at test scores and MCAT scores and, okay, maybe, it's obviously more impressive, at least I think so, if somebody is in the 70th percentile of the MCAT, but had to work 2 jobs because they grew up in a single parent home and, whatever, than somebody who gets in the 80th percentile who grew up in upper middle class just because, the opportunity cost there is stunning. But in general, this has put Jews also on sort of the wrong side of this. So I don't know if you want to go there or if you want to just stick in the actual history here.
It's a really sensitive topic right now, obviously, because of all the so we can talk about that. But one thing I did want to mention before that, historically, one of the interesting ironies during this period of time was as Jewish scholars were able to get out of the impending Nazi overtakeage of much of Europe, many found their way to the United States. That was at a time when there were quotas and quotas against Jews. And one of the places that Jews were able to make a huge contribution and whose doors were open to them were the historically Black colleges. And there are many histories, many stories of Jewish medical professors who ended up at historically Black colleges in the United States because those were the places that offered them positions. And, there's a lot of wonderful stories about those combinations. Did you want to add?
No, I mean, the sad thing, I'm going to kind of words that I would love to hear what you say. I mean, the sad thing is you read accounts from the 60s and 70s, and there was, and still is sort of a natural alliance between the Jewish and Black community for so many obvious reasons you just laid out. I mean, obviously things were much worse for the Black community, but essentially a lot of the blockages to reaching certain sectors of society were the same. I mean, the area in San Diego I grew up, I've told you this many times, but just for listeners, it was, they had a charter until 1960, no Jews and no Blacks. And, interestingly enough, it does relate to medicine because Jonas Salk, who discovered the polio vaccine, right? UCSD, when it was opening, wanted him to head the biology department, right? Impressive guy. Jonas Salk was Jewish. And he essentially said, how am I going to move to the area around UCSD when Jews aren't allowed to live here? And so UCSD actually pressured the town district to say, you got to remove this. So, but in so many ways, the activism was the same. I think, a lot of what's happened in the last couple of years, obviously the Black community is not a monolithic, but a lot of the more activists within the Black community have sort of taken a strong anti-Zionist approach, starting with Black Lives Matter. And, we don't really have to go down that rabbit hole because we can stay topical, but I agree with you. I mean, I think it's almost sad that the history has, bifurcated in a way where, really in the 60s and 70s, at least from what I've read, it was sort of, lockstep partnership there.
There's 17 things I want to say, and I'm going to try to keep it to like 2. One is just to circle back a little bit to talk about the implementation of quotas. I think that the prevalence of Jews in medicine, there is a natural inclination, and then I think there is also the observed reality that when people start killing Jews, usually the doctors are spared because they've saved someone's life among the class of people who are doing the killing. That's true. I'm in a lot of the history of the many European expulsions. That was true during the Holocaust in many cases. It's been true at different points in history in different places that the one Jewish doctor that someone knew was saved.
So we're on the wrong jobs. We're we messed up here.
Yeah, but yeah.
Not because we didn't try.
I mean, if you consider now, like there's an analogous example of like a huge increase in the medical field. You could call it an overrepresentation of the population of Asian immigrants in the medical field. It's a similar reality. They were getting interred here in the United States. They weren't allowed to own land. You couldn't even be a citizen. You could only be a citizen if you were Black or white until like the 1930s. No, there just wasn't a law for any other race. But this incorporation, there's a very similar mentality. There's a very similar history in this model minority myth, this situation of like, if I can prove that I'm useful, that my existence here is useful to the broader community, then maybe they won't try to get rid of us this time. And I think so it's both of those things. You could call it a negative and a positive reinforcement that pushed Jews into medicine in a lot of ways. Because I think if you then have kids, you want them to do a job that's useful, where they won't be on the chopping block, so to speak. I think that when you consider what happened with anti-Semitism in America, it's concurrent with most of Europe at the time. Anti-Semitism was a word that started to be used in Germany in sort of the 1860s. And the first person ever to use it apparently was a Jew who was talking about like bigotry against Jews, but it wasn't popularized that way. It was popularized by German Christian nationalists, National Socialists, who were literally using it openly. It was the way that people use anti-Zionist now. It was a legitimate political philosophy that people used to give themselves credit. And there were multiple parties that endorsed this new anti-Semitism. And as many other academic and political ideas of the time, they started to spread through the channels of, the learned societies and these academic societies and medical societies. And because there was race science involved in anti-Semitism, that too started to spread. So you have this weird phenomenon of so many Jewish doctors everywhere. And then all of a sudden, people are going, we have way too many Jewish doctors. We got to stop this. And there was a legitimate fear that Jews were trying to take over the world by becoming doctors. That was part of this anti-Semitic philosophy.
I can tell you, with the amount of hours it takes in training to become a doctor, if I was going to take over the world, I would not recommend someone suffer through residency.
Yes.
I remember this Charlottesville protest however many years ago where they were saying Jews will not replace us. That's that thing, the great replacement theory.
Yeah.
that Jews are literally trying to take over. So the response of these quotas is very interesting by saying, well, we have to limit it to only having a few Jews. And the difference, I think, between that and the Black community is that the Black community was not overrepresented in medicine. They don't share that history with us. They don't share that kind of bizarre flip. Also the diaspora history is very different. We were lucky to be able to find each other and know who we were the whole time, because we were never really allowed to integrate anywhere. Black people in America were stripped of their identities, even if they wanted to now try to go find out, where are you from? That's a whole difficult process. And Jews had a different set of circumstances globally where we were able to keep track of that better, largely because people just didn't want to interact with us, but that gave us that benefit. So I think it is important to consider that there are, despite the many similarities between the two communities, and there ought to be more solidarity. I think a part of although there was an intentional propagandistic effort by many parties to separate Jews from any other minority community, such that we would never be invited to work with them, because when we do, we represented Native Americans in the 1840s here in land rights trials. We represented Black people during civil rights. We were
Women's rights. Yeah.
Women's rights. We've always been extremely progressive, extremely loud about it,
Yep.
extremely unapologetic about it. We were, I mean, as soon as the Russian Jews got here in 1880s, they started unionizing everybody.
Yep.
So Henry Ford goes, this is a problem for me. And he writes The International Jew. He bought a newspaper in Dearborn, Michigan. By the way, look at the anti-Semitism in Dearborn, Michigan today.
Yep.
So that whole phenomenon is, there's a reality that it was intentional to keep Jews away from everybody, to keep people from trusting Jews. There's also a reality that the success of Jews has been used against Black people a lot. And it's not by Jews, by white people. It's extremely unfair. This kind of concept of like, well, if they can do it after the Holocaust, if they could figure it out, whatever, then why can't you?
You know, let me add to that. So just, I know it's great talking to you, Daniel, because we go off in a lot of directions. But for those, so I'm sure there are listeners who, like me, are old enough to remember the civil rights movements of the 1960s. And when I grew up as a child, the civil rights leaders were our heroes in our Jewish family. And remember, you know, and again, for your listeners that don't celebrate Passover, we said every year, you know, the heart of a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You were slaves. And so there was, as Nora was saying, as you were bringing up, there was this sense of affinity between the two communities, but the differences as well that Nora pointed out. And, you know, while this is not the focus of it, of course, the whole issue of, you know, merit, and now these words have become so pejorative that you can't really talk about them anymore. But the Jewish experience was, we were kept out. We want a fair way of getting back in. And the idea of establishing quotas has always been inimical to Jews. It's always been bad for Jews. You know, I would say, Nora, to your point, that about, and you make, I think what you said was absolutely right. The difference between the Jewish community and the African American community, and the quote success of the Jewish community has somehow been used. I don't think we place enough emphasis on what I see as the remarkable success of the Black community. And, you know, you look at the historically Black colleges, and despite the years of slavery and the years of true apartheid in the United States, that, you know, and this pervasive, at every effort, attempts to keep the Black community from achieving its potential. Look at the historically Black colleges, look at the medical schools that were, you know, established for the African American community, and the phenomenal success that those institutions have had throughout history. I mean, I think it's just remarkable, and I don't think we credit that enough, to tell you the truth.
That's kind of one of those consequences of the model minority myth, and Asian Americans will tell you the same thing, which is, it is offensive to the model minority and it's harmful to every other minority,
Right.
because it's this idea of like, well, why aren't you more like them? Because we're completely different than them. What do you mean? Because the whole situation is different. And I think that that's something that people look, like I said, there's been an intentional campaign by many people at many different points in history to prevent Jews from real legitimate solidarity with communities that we should naturally have solidarity.
Well, that's the sad thing. I mean, you look now and the unions, the LGBTQ centers,
Oh,
the
yeah.
women rights groups, the Black community, a lot of the Native American communities. I mean, these are both values and communities that Jews in America have spent their hard work, blood, sweat, and tears, really because they believe in it and still do largely. And then to see the organizations, obviously not the people, I think those have to be separated. I mean, they've done polls in a lot of these communities. I think the term Latinx is an interesting one. You don't have to comment on it, but just, you poll the Hispanic community and, it has like 10% approval rating, but yet a lot of the activist groups keep using it. And so there is a difference between the groups that say that they are the activist groups on behalf of the population and the population, but it's the activist groups that have looked at Jews and for whatever reason, whether it's giving into Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda, whether it's just general confusion, whether it's, I don't know. It's hard to imagine, why they would do it. I mean, we can come up with theories, but they've really like specifically split it to the sense where now, I mean, it's sad that a lot of Jews feel like, I mean, I've had students all the time that are in some of these other communities, either half Black, half Jewish, LGBTQ and Jewish, tell me they feel like they almost have to make a forced choice, that they don't feel comfortable going to the LGBTQ club on campus because as somebody who is involved in Jewish community, and I'm not talking about someone coming in with like guns blazing Zionism, just somebody who they know is involved with Hillel, they just, are maligned in a really harsh way.
Yeah. Well, 10 years ago when I was a freshman, I was a sophomore, my second year at UCLA, they did a divestment vote for BDS. And this was like the third UC campus that in that kind of time frame that did this. And the UC had said, we're not going to divest no matter what you do. So we're just letting you know that. You can keep doing these votes, we can't stop you, but we're not going to divest no matter what you vote for, because we're not.
I think I just learned that we were at UCLA at the same time, by the way.
Oh, really?
I was a freshman in 2011.
No.
So you said 10 years ago, or
10 years
no, sorry,
ago.
I was a freshman in 2012. So sorry, I'm on a little sleep. I just had a kid. No, so I would have been there in 20. You were there.
No, I was a little later.
A little later. Okay.
Okay.
Well, we'll do the math later.
Okay.
Yeah. No, yeah. We probably just passed each other.
Because I was there at the divestment. I remember.
You were there at that
small school.
divestment.
I know.
Yeah.
I was. It was like the all-night one. It was 13 hours. It was insane.
All night
It was
long?
No, that was actually for me, it was funny because coming into college, the listeners can see why this is somewhat relevant. I grew up, in the Orthodox community, and I just wasn't that interested in Israel activism, right? Like Israel was a part of my identity just as a Jew, but I wasn't really involved in any of these wider conversations of anti-Zionism. I was just, whatever, why do we need this? And that night was sort of like a real call to arms for me, because I remember sitting there and listening to the stuff people were saying about Israel. And I had lived in Jerusalem for 2 years before this. And I remember saying, like, this is just wrong. Like, this is just people that had never been there before. So that's the only reason why I cut you off.
Let's talk about college, because this is a very important point that a lot of people don't understand. So I wasn't at UCLA as an undergraduate in 2011. I was an undergraduate in 1966. And I was one of the first students at UC Santa Cruz, which unfortunately now has a reputation for being very anti-Semitic, although it's not true really of any of the UCs. But so what was happening between 1966 and 1970 that we can learn some lessons from about anti-Semitism, medicine, and all the things that were going on in the world. Okay, well, in 1967 was the Six-Day War. Huge shot in the arm for the American Jewish community. I can't, for people who weren't there and don't remember that, what happened in those months before the Six-Day War, when it really looked like Israel might be wiped off the map, and you had this several months of building up pressure, and then the Six-Day War and its victory at that time was a shot in the arm. 1960 to 1970, the rise of the anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, was really starting to crescendo. The first large march, I think 1965, 100,000 people in San Francisco, for example, really turned the corner. And the resurfacing of the civil rights movement, the civil rights movement obviously had never gone away, but it reestablished itself in a big way during those periods of time. So young men like me were faced with very real decisions because the war in Vietnam was going on and the draft was real, and you could end up in Vietnam in a war that no matter what your politics were, you were wondering why was any American kid being sent there when there were 50,000 casualties, and you were starting to see it on the news every day. So we would have these rallies back in those days, and sometimes we would go up to Berkeley, and there would be anti-Vietnam War protests. Inevitably, there would be a speaker who would compare vitriolically against the United States, but would compare the United States to Israel and the Arabs. This was then. This was more than 50 years ago when this was happening. And friends and I, who were pretty involved with Israel, we would speak up and say this is an invidious and unfair and incorrect comparison. But then that comparison was almost limited exclusively to these campuses, to these elite, you might want to call them, I didn't consider it elite, but the UC campuses. So the themes that we're seeing now, the colonial settler phrase, well, I heard it then. Israel is the aggressor. I heard it then. The displacement of the Palestinian people, an unclear and untrue view of history. The difference is that now it has become so much more widespread. So when I say to people, this is nothing new to me. I've heard this on the campuses ever since I was a kid, ever since I was a freshman. But what has happened is that element of the political academe has become much stronger over the years. And so the dichotomy that you referred to, that here you've got the Jewish community, which had this affinity for minorities like African Americans and had supported them in many, many ways. In some ways feel almost, quote, betrayed now that we're not seeing the love in return. And it's a complex topic, you know?
Well, that's why I think that vote it was also for me, it was very stark because I think that this is common for Jews, but all of us are raised with different civil rights heroes as heroes. Like, especially, it's a different conversation, but most of us have this affinity and this kind of knowledge. And I think in America, we're raised with this idea that it happened to us and now it's over. And so your job is to help everybody else because your job is to help everybody else. How could you go through that and then not? And I think it almost doesn't occur to a lot of us that there is anything still happening on our own behalf that we would be fighting for. So most of the Jewish kids that I know didn't even know anything about anti-Semitism, didn't know anything about what was going on in Israel. Like some of them did, but most American Jews that I knew were under this really like rose-colored glasses. It's over. Everybody loves us now because that's what our parents taught us. And our communities didn't really all the time. I mean, it wasn't necessarily obvious unless you were looking for it. And so I am, when I got to UCLA, I'm gay. So I was involved in a lot of those kinds of activities. I was doing poetry on campus. So naturally, that's like a very kind of artsy, interdisciplinary sort of space. And I went to this meeting and I was blindsided because on this side of the room were Jews and on this side of the room was everybody else. And I was like, what is this? The visual of that, for one, was so weird. Like Jews on this side of the room was just stark and very strange. And I had no idea what was happening. I had like no idea what was happening. And it was really upsetting. And I mean, I eventually left UCLA. I didn't finish my degree for that and other reasons, but there was something about it that I don't know. It was so weird to see in front of me. So I've been aware of it for a long time.
But, I think also what's important here is and this is a very important theme, and it gets us back to the medical schools, was the shock of October 7th, 2023. That you, as you described, Nora, you had the vast majority of Jewish faculty in the School of Medicine. I mean, they had affinity towards their background, but they never considered it an issue. But then you have this event that occurs in 2023, and it sort of popped this bubble of both anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Now, I'm one who believes that they're very close, anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, because I'm a Zionist and I believe strongly in Israel and its right to exist and its connection to the Jewish people. But for many Jews, this was very problematic. For Jews who recognized their background but never felt that it was, quote, an issue, it became an issue all of a sudden. And you, Rabbi Daniel, you pointed out that there seemed to be elements in groups that the Jews had thought we had strong relations with that now became very vitriolically anti-Israel, borderline anti-Semitic, and in some cases anti-Semitic. So what we've seen in the last year and a half has been this shockwave of October 23rd, of October 7th. Again, for me, this wasn't new. And when I tried to describe this to my friends, they don't believe me. They go, this is all new. We've never seen this before. And I said, no, it's actually been around for a long time, And so back on October 7th, a few of our friends like Professor Dara Sorkin, whom and I and others said, we've got to organize some kind of Jewish faculty presence at UCI because Jews are afraid to talk. Jewish students are afraid in general because of all the things that are going on. And I think it's interesting that in the many years I've been here for 28 years, and in the years before, I mean, how many times did you and I meet? Once, twice, something like that. All of a sudden, we're thinking we've got to think about this because it is an issue.
Yeah, and that, I mean, there's so many different ways. I feel your struggle. Let's back up for 1 second because there's one more thread that I want to loop, and then I want to spend the last part talking all about what's happened in the last year and a half, and then like where we think we might go from here. But the last thread I want to talk about is Zionism in Israel, specifically the intersection with medicine, because I've talked about Zionism in Israel a lot before, generally, but never really brought into this medical piece. We were talking a lot about this the other day, so I'm curious. I mean, if you can sort of set up, I mean, just the one thing that I'll say is, I mean, the original Zionists, Theodor Herzl, the political Zionists, were all very socially liberal, atheistic, right? They were coming from Western Europe. And unlike the colonialists of the period, whose sole goal was to show up, plunder, they, at some cases hated, in other cases just had no awareness of the local native population, and they were just trying to, enrich themselves and bring it back to a motherland. When you read Herzl's essays about what he hopes to accomplish there, now, again, we could say Herzl might have been a bit naive, but he's writing about how they're going to set up this, railroad system that's going to connect, and it's going to be good for, everybody, Arabs and Jews, because again, in his socialist worldview, everything in some way reduces to economics. So this isn't a, I'm going to buy you to ruin your identity, right? Like he really believed that, what causes strife between people, what class warfare, material conditions. So you show up, you build railroads and hospitals and everything like that, and then everybody loves it. And that actually is what happened, right? You listeners are probably expecting me to say, and of course, everyone rejected it. But the population of, even this is pre-World War I, if you look at population charts from, the 1880s, because that's, of course, when Zionism started, right? Just when just when most Jews were coming to the Americas, some Jews from Russia, Chobabit Zion, went to, Israel. You can remember it, the scene at the end of Fiddler on the Roof when Tevye and everybody else says they're going to New York or Chicago, and then that one, Yenta is I'm going to Jerusalem, So, okay, some small percentage went there, and then, Herzl is about 10 years later. The population, proliferated in terms of not just Jews, but Arabs, because they were moving there because all of a sudden material conditions were so great. So I'm curious if you can just walk us through a little bit of the 140-year history of Israel Zionism and medicine there. We can spend a couple minutes on that before going to October 7th.
But one thing, if I may, is that I think it's really important to remember that yes, there was, the first and second Aliyah, and this burst of population. But it's also critical to remember that the Jewish connection to the land of Israel was continuous and never really, there wasn't a time when there weren't Jews there. And I'd read from even some scholars here at UCI who have written what I think are really terribly hurtful and almost naive ideas. Well, why didn't the Jews start going back to Israel in the 1400s and the 1500s? And I have this image of some poor Jew in the middle of Poland calling up a travel agent and said, "Could you book me a couple of tickets?" There were technological changes. There was an ability to get there. There was the growth of nationalism. And I'm going to let Nora talk about, because she's the one that really helped me get through this, is that the more modern Zionist movement was infused with health. Health was huge. And you had big problems in the Holy Land. You had malaria and you had diseases. I'll let you take it from there, because you really taught me a lot about this.
Well, I think it's also one thing, people didn't want to go to Israel because Israel wasn't a place, really. Israel was there was the whole area, Syria, Palestina, that was what's now Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan, and a little bit more on the outskirts. And that was one place. I was actually just reading, this made me laugh. I was reading some correspondence from the United States State Department in 1912, and they're signing it, the Consular Office, Jerusalem, Syria. So it's been a bunch of different places. And there was malaria, there were all these problems with swamps. There was a lot of attempts at colonization from a lot of different countries. There were big German Templar colonies in what became the Palestine Mandate. There were American Christian missionaries. There were English Christian missionaries. There were all sorts of different Christian missionaries from all over Europe who obviously wanted to go and colonize the Holy Land, which was not that dissimilar of a desire to the Jews who wanted to do that. It was just that the Jews wanted to go there because that's where they were from, and the Christians wanted to go there because of their religious convictions, which is a different thing. But their attempt to colonize was sometimes widespread, the German Templars was, but the other ones were sort of like what you kind of think of as missions. They were doing these hospitals and they had some education. That was the only alternative to healthcare in that area at the time, because the Ottomans sort of didn't care about this enclave. It was not an important region. It was full of disease. There were not a lot of people that lived there. It was not important to them religiously. They just didn't care. And one of the first hospitals that was ever built there was funded by the Rothschilds. The Rothschild Hospital was built in like 1886 or something like that. And then the Jews showed up in large numbers. And Henrietta Souls, who was the founder of the Women's Zionist Organization of America, also known as Hadassah, her idea was practical Zionism, because the Jews were aware that there were people there, including other Jews. And Zionists were talking about this with each other, like, how are we going to do this? We don't want to be assholes. We want to go back to our land. We want to decolonize it, but we also don't want to do what all these people are doing. It's gross and weird. What if we actually can just make it a nice place for everybody, and it doesn't have to be some horrible thing? And so she called this practical Zionism. She said, we're going to go and we're going to build hospitals, and we're going to make sure that those hospitals serve the entire community. And that's what we're going to do. And so this is practical Zionism, which I love that phrase very much. And they build their first, I want to make sure that I'm getting my dates right. So it's founded in 1912. They serve the whole community, and one of the big things that they did was the first such center of these opened in 1921 was fertility centers. They were called Tipat Halav, a drop of milk, and they were open to everybody.
Which exists, by the way, to this day.
To this day. And I found some really striking accounts of nurses who worked there who were talking about. There was one observer who said that she noticed nurses speaking in all sorts of different languages. Some were speaking Arabic, some were speaking Hebrew, some were speaking English, some were speaking Polish, like just depending on whoever was there. And there was this account from a nurse who was talking about the differences between Western medicine that was coming from European migrants and Eastern medicine. and how to cross those cultural divides and how to reach out to the existing population and kind of try to dispel disbelief. And what she was saying was, you can't just bulldoze people and tell them this is what you're doing wrong, stop doing it. You have to try to understand where they're coming from. This was like an account in 1925. So there was this, real attention to the necessity of building hospitals and serving the community. And the outcome of that has also been documented and noted by many, many, many different observers at many, many, many different points throughout history. But one of the most, I think, striking pieces was reported in the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry in 1944, which was commissioned by the English and the Americans. And it was a group of scientists, doctors, politicians, Jews, non-Jews from all over the place to go and just see what was going on, because this was still the British mandate and they asked the Americans for help. It's because they were doing an oil deal, but officially it's because they just wanted their help. And one of the reports from the health section was that the most significant increases in health outcomes among Arabs were in areas that were close to Jewish areas. Not only health outcomes, but the highest rates of immigration of Arabs into the Palestine Mandate were in areas where there were a lot of Jews. And that was consistent despite a lot of these growing anti-Zionist efforts that really start showing up in this region. I mean, you can put a different date on it. 1914 is sort of when the Ottomans start talking about Zionism. 1920 is when a pamphlet shows up at a lodge to promote interfaith community. A pamphlet shows up called The Jewish Plot to Take Over the World, which was the same one that appeared in Russia 20-ish years earlier. And hospitals and the Jewish medical infrastructure is one of the places that becomes repeatedly and directly targeted by anti-Zionist violence, because they know that it's effectively serving the community.
Yeah, this, if I may, so my experience was, when I finished my internship, I went to med school at UC San Francisco. I did a year of internship, and I wanted to get back to Israel. And I ended up in 1977 as a physician and a first-year resident at Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. And Nora was talking about the violence. Well, as you know, and maybe many of the audience knows, that with the War of Independence, when Israel was attacked by a whole group of Arab countries, and Jerusalem was a major site of the battle, well, half of Jerusalem was in Arab Jordanian hands at that time, and half was in the hands of the new Israel. But there was a little mountain, Mount Scopus, where the first medical center in that area had ever been built by Hadassah, which had been, as I said, that was the medical school. But the land between it and Jewish Jerusalem was occupied by Jordan. So you really couldn't use that space anymore. Now, as a result of the Six-Day War, that area was became part of Jewish Jerusalem. My group of doctors, I started out at Hadassah Hospital in Ein Kerem, another part of Jerusalem. They had to rebuild the hospital after the war in 1948, 1947. I was part of the group that reestablished the Israeli medical presence at Mount Scopus. And it did this the route that many years before, a group of Israelis who were going up to Mount Scopus had been attacked and almost virtually killed, including the person who was the head of the Hadassah Hospital at the time. So this was this great moment that I was able to participate in. We reenacted that caravan from Ein Kerem back up to Mount Scopus, and I worked there, and that hospital served everybody. I spent time in Gaza even at that time when the doors were still open. And what strikes me is that you will sort of hear this. I'm sorry. Cell phones are not allowed. Cell phones not allowed. So you will sort of hear this idea that this is part of colonialism, that medical care is used as colonialist. But what really belies that is the fact that, and I showed this in my grand rounds, that Israel has tried to increase the number of healthcare professionals among every community, including the Arab community. So it's not like we're using healthcare to take over, or we're using healthcare to advance this, pernicious notion of settler colonialism. In fact, we're bringing, it is an open society. There are 2 new medical schools that just opened in the last month in Israel. They're open to all talented people who can get into medical school. I think the University of Haifa is about 30 to 40% Arab population right now. So to me, I felt that when I was there.
Well, and I want to just expand on that concept of colonialism, which is that once the British gained the mandate for Palestine at the end of World War I, officially, I think it was 1920, they set up this sort of, they had a government structure that was like the colonial whatever that was related to England, to which you pay taxes, and the taxes are collected, and then that money is distributed for civil services. Now, the Jews were paying significant majority of the taxes because materially they could. The Arab population at the time was largely nomadic, was largely not really participating in the same sorts of industry that a lot of these immigrants had been. So in order to tax people, they kind of have to be operating on the same economic system that you are. And some of the Jews were, some of them weren't. Like the Yeshub, who were the Jews that had been there the whole time, were like, we're not paying you taxes. Is a similar attitude to a lot of the Bedouins and the Arabs, who were like, who the hell are you guys? We're not paying you any taxes. But the Jews who had been recent or more recent European immigrants were more familiar with this idea. So they were paying a significant majority of it. And their institutions, the hospitals, education centers, their own governmental practices, their attempts to drain the swamps to help malaria, their attempts to create a purified water system for the first time. Those things were not funded by the British tax collected money. Those were funded by the Jewish diaspora. And Jews, I mean, you can look at newspaper archives, and almost every newspaper archive between 1900 and 1950, almost every newspaper in the West, there's some ad somewhere from like the Free Palestine Commission, which at the time was Jews, being like, we need your $5 to build more water and
Which
to
was a
build
lot
more
of money.
hospitals.
Yeah. No, the irony, I mean, you just mentioned that, and this is a total non sequitur, but a lot of the marketing that the anti-Israel movements use about talking about how incredible of a place Palestine were all Jewish Zionist publications. I mean, there's that famous picture saying visit Palestine that has a picture of Jerusalem. And that was a Zionist pamphlet, exactly what you're saying, to spread around in Europe and America to get Jews interested. And so, it's just, it's so ironic because, as we were mentioning, Zionists were trying their best to like lift all tides. And I think a general trend that I'm at least getting at, and I guess this really cements my position as a capital L liberal and not a progressive, is that, and I feel like Jews have been caught on the wrong side of this, is liberalism has been really good for Jews, right? This idea that we're going to treat everybody—
True liberalism,
right? This idea that we're going to treat everybody as individuals, and that it doesn't really make a difference about your background, and, you're not Dan the Jew, and I'm not Daniel the Jew, and, whatever, you're Dan the person, whatever, and you're judged by merit. That has nothing to do with your race, religion, creed, gender orientation, all of that. That is distinct from a progressive ideology that, tries to pinpoint certain groups for, some groups raising up, which by definition means you're making a selection game, which is going to, hurts other groups. And it's the same thing in all of these cases, right? The people that are upset that even till this day, that healthcare is better for everybody at hospitals that are involved with Zionists, they're not going to be happy because essentially their goal is not to raise up everyone. They see the world as a zero-sum game, whereas capital L true liberals, as you said, right, they don't see the world as a zero-sum game, right? True liberalism, I think that, if my material conditions get better, that's actually good for you in some way because, hopefully in general, if there's the incentives in place, either the goodwill or capitalist incentives, you're going to go out and spend that money on, a better hospital, better training for yourself. But then when I get sick, I come to you. So I'm not looking at you, in your position as a doctor saying, grr, like, who did you have to step on to get there? I'm saying, I hope you're 10% smarter than, the doctors were 20 years ago. Because if my kid, God forbid, needs a pediatric doctor, I know who I'm on.
So this brings us
speed dial
back
to. Yeah.
right. This brings us back to a really, really important point, which is how did this grand rounds that I gave a week and a half ago with the help of you and Nora and others, how did this come about and why is it relevant? Well, it came about because we saw that there was an advertisement for a conference to be held at UCI, which advertised this concept of systematic Israeli genocide, which for any caring Jew and any caring Zionist is pure anti-Semitism. This idea, this conflation, and this bastardization of the term genocide and putting it next to Israel is so profoundly historically incorrect and is so hateful that it matches to, the old ideas of the Jewish blood libel. That's where it is. And so when we saw that, it just kind of crystallized the idea, what is going on in our campus? What's happening? And we discovered that a grand rounds had been given in the Department of Surgery by some of the people that had been involved in that particular talk. And to me, that sort of opened the door. I said, well, look, if the Department of Surgery at UCI invited someone to give a grand rounds on that topic with that sort of theme, I'm going to see if I can be invited. And to the credit of the Department of Surgery, I was invited officially to give a grand rounds. And we put that together. And one of the themes that I really tried to emphasize was this special role that the physician has with the patient, which I think is very Jewish when we think about it. And I used William Carlos Williams, the famous, nobody's heard of him anymore. But
yeah, maybe you should explain to our listeners who this famous person is.
Yeah,
but,
there wasn't
none of them have ever heard of him.
1920s, he won the Pulitzer Prize. He was a great poet, but he was a physician. And he understood that his art as a poet and a storyteller had been influenced by his being a physician. And this is why I think it's a very Jewish concept, because he wasn't Jewish. But he said, as a physician, perfect strangers would literally take off their clothes in your presence. They would tell you the most intimate details of their lives, things that they might not even share with a spouse, a father, a mother, or a son. And that informed his art. And when you think about Jewish philosophy and Jewish ethics, knowledge of God and the world is that, isn't it? It's this achieving this understanding at a level which is not in the normal run of life. And so the physician, and this is a point I tried to make, you have this very special relationship. And I, as a physician, would be heartbroken if a patient ever thought that prejudice on my part or some political belief on my part would ever get in the way of how I cared for that particular person. And I've been a doctor for many years now. I think I got my license in 1975, right? So that's like the 50. And I've taken care of many, many different people. And I don't know. I just never had a situation where I didn't feel that my whole focus at that moment was to take care of that individual the best way I possibly could. Now, look, my physicians from any classroom religion feel that way. I think I was helped because of my Jewish background to feel that way. And it gets back to what you began this discussion with about how terrible it was that these two nurses could, on a public venue, say that they would kill patients because they were Israelis, or that they would deny care. And I think and this happened, I think, after I gave the grand rounds, it was in the last week or so. I mean, what we tried to do was to say, we as physicians have this particularly unique role. And so we have to be careful what we say. We have to understand where we are contextually. And I do think, as I said, that that it was influenced by Jewish philosophy and Jewish ideas. And look, Israel's not perfect, but my experience and the experience of so many of us is that Israeli medicine, Israeli society in general has accepted that role of humanism as well.
Well, and it's caused us a lot of grief too, because there are so many ironies throughout our history where it's like, if you had been less of a nice guy, maybe this wouldn't have happened. Like the whole thing with a lot of Hitler and Sinwar both have these Jewish doctor stories. That's interesting.
Can you talk about Sinwar just for people that are not familiar? Can you give the...
He was in an Israeli prison for terrorism. He, while in prison, was visiting the dentist who noticed something weird.
An Israeli dentist.
An Israeli dentist, while in Israeli prison. I should say a Jewish Israeli dentist. The Jewish Israeli dentist said, something's wrong with your brain. We're going to go get you a scan. So he goes to see a Jewish Israeli neurologist who says, you have a brain tumor. We have to take it out. They perform life-saving surgery. They catch the problem. They perform life-saving surgery. What, 10 years later, he's the head of Hamas and directs the October 7th massacre in 2023. Despite, he thanked the surgeon. He said, thank you. I really appreciate it. I hope I can find some way to pay you back one day. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, which, for the record, the Grand Mufti is a made-up role by the British. The British invented that when they got there to try to kind of go, well, it's a very important position for you. Herbert Samuel, who is a Jewish British politician, is the guy who appointed him to that position because Herbert Samuel, a Jew, wanted to be sensitive to what was going on and said, I understand that this is a very prominent family in the region. These are very important people religiously. We're going to appoint this guy that seems to be the choice of the Arabs.
This is in the 1940s, just for, because we are bouncing around the 20s.
20.
No, but just to be clear, because we're bouncing.
He gets appointed by a Jew in 1920. 10 years later, he orchestrates the Hebron massacre, the Jaffa riots, in which the Hadassah clinic at Hebron was burned down, which was largely...
Not Herbert Samuel, the Mufti.
The Mufti, which was largely serving Arabs. There are attacks on hospitals because of anti-Zionism, because of the Mufti of Jerusalem, all throughout this period of time between the 1920s and, I mean, until now. But he was really the guy. He eventually was exiled from the Mandate of Palestine by the British after several riots, years of organizing riots against Jews. He's finally exiled. Where does he go? Berlin in 1941, where he spends the war in Berlin. He starts recruiting Bosnian Muslims to join the situation. The person who translated the German dictionary to Arabic was a Jew who was studying Islam at a German university. And she was tasked by the Nazis. She was a young Jewish girl with writing this dictionary. She had already started working on it. She was supposed to be sent to a death camp. She was given an extension to finish the dictionary. She finished the dictionary, and then she was sent to a death camp and executed.
This is why you should never finish a dictionary.
There are, throughout our, I mean, it's maddening. Throughout our history, there are these moments where you're like, if we were less altruistic a little bit, maybe some of this could have been avoided. And so you feel that feeling of being tempted to say, it's not worth it. And yet, throughout our history, the Hadassah rebuilt the Hebron hospital, continued serving Arabs. It was never a question that they would stop taking Arab patients. To this day, Palestinians, Syrians, Jordanians, Egyptians are served in Israeli hospitals. Israel has done trainings and has reached out to do medical healthcare trainings with its neighbors, partially altruistically, and also partially because they're a region. It's in everyone's best interest if the overall health of the region improves. So it's not just because we're so great, it's also because we're a community and we see that we're a part of that community. And to uplift everyone's health is good. And throughout the 140-year history of the Zionist healthcare, whatever endeavor you want to call it, there has been an intentional effort to continue to treat, serve with equality, with respect, and with dignity everyone,
Yeah.
One of the hostages who was buried today, you probably saw this, was a member of one of the kibbutzim that was right near the border. And this was a man who devoted much of his day to helping Gazans get to Israeli medical facilities. This is what he did. He facilitated transports. And again, when I hear from people who are medical students in Gaza and they rail against this and they go, "Oh, this is colonialism," it really makes my heart sink.
And Israel
Because
has responded to some of this because there was an accusation that it's an apartheid, whatever. 10 years ago, Israel launched these. I mean, the Arab representation in medical healthcare fields was slightly below the population total. So Arabs are about 20% of the population of Israel. They were 17 to 18% in healthcare in 2010. By 2023, after initiatives launched by Israeli healthcare facilities, industries, institutions, they're now over-indexing.
right, doctors,
across
nurses,
the board.
pharmaceutical scientists.
Yeah, in other words, there's active affirmative action right now in Israel to help Arabs get into.
I mean, I wouldn't use, I think, again, affirmative action is such a loaded word. There's been outreach. They're saying, our doors are open. Our doors are open.
Yeah. So there is this sort of the Jewishy word I want to use is taiva, but this strong inclination I'll say to adopt the sort of screw everyone else mentality. How has that helped? Perhaps the secret to Jewish survival and exceptionalism has been precisely that we've rejected that and we've have this view that all of humanity is one and that we really do want to help. So I think that is a real tension within the contemporary Jewish mind and Jewish community. In a second, I'm going to ask each of you, for one final thought or one other thing that we haven't touched on. So prepare yourselves. But the one story that I wanted to tell is the interview with the head of the ER in the hospital in Pittsburgh after the Tree of Life shooting in 2017. I don't know if you ever listened to this, but this is sort of, I think must listen for any, Jew and or doctor, for sure for Jewish doctors, which is, the guy who just killed, 11 people on that Shabbat morning in Pittsburgh. The shooter was rushed to a hospital and the surgical team performed, surgery on him. I think he was shot by the police, and somebody, I think it was the head of the department, but somebody in the surgery was a Jewish doctor. And so he went on CNN and they were basically asking him, how are you doing? How are you helping this guy? This is, I think it was a synagogue that he belonged to. It was just some crazy connection. And his answer was basically saying, when a patient comes in my doors, it makes no difference, what their background is. I see, a human, they have, an ailment. My job as a physician is to heal. It's, the court's job to figure out, the ethics of this guy afterwards. And I was, I still am a little bit shaken aback. I don't know. I mean, I guess, what choice do you have? But I mean, it just seems crazy hard to be able to do that. But it's so much the polar opposite of the situation in Australia. It's almost crazy to think that those two different mentalities exist right now in the medical system. And it is scary. I mean, just because of the rise of social media now. And again, we're only talking about the people that explicitly post these things, not people that are sitting there, maybe talking in close groups of friends or thinking these things. But it is scary.
And maybe acting upon them in ways that we don't know.
Exactly, right. It is terrifying. I mean, I would be lying if I hadn't told you, and this is true. I wear a kippah everywhere I go. There have been a couple times where I went to the doctor that I've taken off my kippah because, why give them just that 1% pause of like, oh, this guy, like, I don't need it. And that's a crazy thing. Again, I don't think that there's actual, any evidence of anything, but like, for me, it's just, whatever. There's going to be, if, I need to get some treatment or, I've gotten surgery a couple times in the last few years, like there's probably 15 different people that look after you, the whole time, why risk it? I'll just go in as, Daniel, whatever, which is a crazy thought. Anyway, I know we've been talking for a while. So what did we miss? What other things do you want to hit on? What are sort of concluding thoughts, any and all those things?
Okay, I have two thoughts. The first one is, I think that a practice of mine is to remember that a big and very effective part of anti-Semitic and now anti-Zionist propaganda is fake popularity. If you look at the Holocaust, there were several embarrassing attempts by higher Nazis to try to prove that Germans were super on board with anti-Semitism. The first boycott they organized was a fucking failure. Germans were walking past the SS officers into Jewish businesses, like, what are you gonna do, shoot me? And the SS officers were like, no. And then eventually they were like, we're gonna have to start shooting them if they go in the shop.
But this is even scarier that you're telling me. I agree with you. And, Hannah Arendt, the German Jewish, thinker who lived through the Holocaust, termed this coin the banality of evil, which is precisely her point. That's almost more scary, because if we think of Nazi Germany as this qualitatively different place where people were walking around, like what you're sort of implying now is, what I think is obviously true, but it's just scary to hear it, is things can get terrible even despite most people, which is the case today, just having no connection to it. And whatever, I want to go home and watch Netflix. I don't care what's happening. Anyway, sorry to cut you off there.
It is. A long time ago, I decided that for me, the world ultimately is less scary if people are not crazy. If I don't think half the world is crazy, how did they get to the conclusion that they got to? What's the logic? For me, it's important to remember that a lot of the way that we feel as Jews, and a lot of the way that people who are anti-Israel right now feel, is because it's working. The propaganda is working. It's meant to make us feel scared. It's meant to make them feel angry. It's meant to make us think that there are way more people on that side than there aren't. But if you look at Palestine historically and today, we can talk about brainwashing and we can talk about indoctrination, which obviously exists. And yet, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are trying to get into Israeli hospitals for treatment every week, despite the brainwashing in schools that we know exists, despite this stuff that we know is real. Like, my mom will tell you, they got a good dose of communist propaganda growing up in Poland. And she said, do you really believe it? If your life you think is being threatened, if it is in fact being threatened, you look at the Axis powers, they didn't have successful militaries because everybody wanted to do it. They had successful militaries because they were going to shoot you if you didn't go fight. That's how you motivate people into this kind of violence. We're seeing that in Israel right now. We're seeing people suspected of being Zionist collaborators in Gaza being hung from cranes in the modern day. And I think it's very important to remember that for myself, not because of any big thing, but the reality is that most people do benefit from Jews existing, and most people know that. And they don't know what to do. They don't have a clear way to say, I don't understand why this is happening. I don't know why people are saying this about Israel. I don't know what's going on. Everyone's yelling at me. In Gaza, your situation is life and death if you say the wrong thing to Hamas. Here, we have all of this intricate social capital. Even if I come around to the conclusion that I'm not a Jew, but I listened to this brilliant podcast and now I've totally changed my opinion, what are you supposed to do? I've lost friends. I've lost job opportunities. I was supposed to have a book published. I got into a fight with the book publisher about the public statement they made about Gaza, despite that they've never made a political statement ever in the 10 years we've been working together. And I haven't heard from them. There is not a clear path to do the right thing. And I think it's important to remember that when we're wondering, why aren't people doing the right thing? It's not necessarily comforting beyond just being a little bit comforting. You know what I mean? So again, with these cases of these nurses, that's terrible. It's really scary. And also, there's probably a percentage of people in every field doing life-saving work who have said atrocious shit like that on camera, willingly. I don't think that Arab doctors are over-indexing in that. I think the fact that that news from Australia is being spread here so vociferously is meant to make it look either legitimate or to scare Jews, And I try to just keep myself grounded in a certain level of it's like what I'm talking about with the Jews kind of having this sort of maybe you should give people less of the benefit of the doubt, but I give a lot of benefit of the doubt. I assume most people are overwhelmed, scared, and don't have the time to actually learn what they need to learn to understand what's going on.
But after our 3-hour conversation.
Mhm. Now they're going to be, yeah.
So,
it's the
here's
panacea here.
here's my last thought on this, and it really segues into what you were saying. I was thinking about this in terms of UC Irvine. So UC Irvine has had moments in its history when it's been considered, quote, an anti-Semitic institution. Certainly 10 years ago, when there were disruptions at various, speaking efforts, and then Chancellor Drake bravely stopped that. So now we've had a couple of episodes where there's been the appearance that this is an anti-Semitic institution because certain photographs that were taken and so forth and so on. So I've been here for 28 years, and I want to tell the community that no, we're not an anti-Semitic institution. I like what you said about this. The fact that I was invited immediately by the Department of Surgery to give a grand rounds, which is supposed to be medical. The fact that we work with Reb Daniel over here, and we're seeing an increased enthusiasm among Jewish students. And we're sitting in this Hillel house here, which is fairly new and has become a center for Jewish life for students is important. The fact that the response to that grand rounds has been so positive from Jewish faculty, who said, we're so glad you did that. And Rabbi Daniel's spouse, who is if I may, a resident in surgery and really just an outstanding individual, told me that when she talked to her friends who had been able to attend the grand rounds, they said, we really needed to hear that. So this institution, as you were saying, Nora, is people are overwhelmed, but it's an open institution. And the message should be, don't be afraid. It's okay to speak out. In the medical profession, remember who you are. You're doctors. You have a role. You have an obligation. Doesn't mean you can't speak out, but speak out in a way that's sensitive. And I still think that this profession of medicine is very Jewish because of that godlike, whether you believe or not, that godlike relationship it gives you to another human being, whoever that human being may be. And that to me is sort of the essence of what I've learned in this past year.
Well, Dr. Dan Cooper, Nora, thank you so much.
Thank you.